Let's start out first with the NDTC. If you guys are not familiar, I'm sure you were on the training before, but if you're not, the National Democratic Training Committee, we train Democrats for free. If you haven't been to the website, we ask that you do, traindemocrats.org. We're at TrainDems, hashtag TrainDems if you're tweeting about us or any other kind of social. We have 4 or 5 years now of material on the back end with all of the trainings that we've done in the past, plus more information you can find out about how to run these campaigns, work on campaigns, or volunteer for those campaigns. So with that, let's jump into how do we connect with voters through personal stories. A little bit about me. My name's Chuck Cook, former political director, a long time with labor unions. Also worked for the Maryland Democratic Party, worked at campaigns from every level. I'm glad that Rory brought up 2008. That was my first election where I jumped in as well before I made it a full-time career to work in this field. So I love working on field, which is knocking doors, making phone calls, like he said, and talking to voters directly. It's one of my favorite parts of campaigning. That's my information below if you have any questions or if you want to ask anything about particular campaigns. Let's jump forward and look at our Get Out the Vote training series. So what's happening today? We're going to talk about how to connect with voters through personal stories and tips for effective. Hold on real quick. Tips for next week is going to be creating effective digital call to action. 3 is tips for effective door-to-door canvassing. Then we'll move to tips for effective phone banking, how to help supporters make plans to vote. That's going to be on October the 22nd. And then how to help supporters make a plan to vote on October 29th as we lead out into the final GOTV time. So what are our learning objectives today? We want to use the story of self framework to motivate others to take action. And I'm going to go through what that framework looked like and what we're doing in motivation and actually turning someone's interest, maybe it's a side interest, maybe it's something that's more on fire, turning that into actual action. And that's the important part. I do have an icebreaker here for you guys if you want to start putting comments in the chat and YouTube. What do you think why do you think stories and storytelling are so important to organizers and political campaigns? If you guys want to just put answers in there, we'd love to see them as they come through. So why your stories matter. Before I jump into this, I think that it's a truism and we should always center ourselves in this idea that voting is fundamentally an emotional action. We all like to sit around and say, you know, we go through every single little pros and cons and work out a spreadsheet to determine our votes based on all of the little policy matters. But fundamentally, it comes down to more of an emotional and a gut choice than anything else. And stories matter because we, as human beings, connect mostly through stories, not through data, not through 12-point white papers, but through those stories and through that back and forth that we have with other human beings, and why it's so important that these stories are told. These stories are done in such a way to gather someone's attention and to gain them, persuade them to move to where we need to get them to be. So that's why the stories matter, right? Personal stories, right? In the context of campaigns and organizing, stories are personal accounts of the impacts issues have on real people. So we're giving issues a face, right? Not just blindly putting data out there. We're giving it a face, we're giving it a name, we're giving it a story, something you can wrap your head around as another human, right? It's an important part of making the abstract concrete and making the political personal. An impactful story should answer the question, why should I support this specific candidate or cause, right? At the end of the day, we're going to tell this story and it's going to answer that question as what that story is going to do. So connection to hope and action, right? The connection stories bridge the personal and the political, right? Making abstract issues relatable. Why should I care? Into hope and action. Convey hope, motivating others to take action, voting, volunteering, donating that express their values. So what can I do about it, right? Stories are the means by which we establish personal connections and convey that hope, right? It's easier for people to understand why they should care about something when a name and a face are attached to the issue, especially when we see ourselves reflected in the story and the experience it's shared. And this isn't to say people shouldn't be presented with statistics, in fact. They should be used to bolster your story. They should be used to hold up the overarching story that you're trying to tell. It's best to connect. The facts should be contextualized to stories that bring them to life, right? So let me give you 2 quotes, and you tell me what you think feels more relevant, right? First quote, The earth is warming at an unsustainable pace, and it's already devastating communities. We need an administration that gets how big of a deal this climate crisis is already, right? Versus the second quote. A dozen people in our country died this summer because of the heat wave. Most of them were seniors. So we need an administration that gets how big of a deal this climate crisis is already. Now, I would argue the second quote is more impactful, right? You are putting at least people here, right? Instead of just saying the earth is warming at an unsustainable pace, which is very ephemeral. It's not something you can glom onto emotionally. But when I tell you a dozen people in our country died this summer because of the heat wave, most of them were seniors. That's much easier for you to wrap your head around and see a problem on the ground and put a name and a face to it. So that story actually is a much better connection with someone. We know our grandparents. We know folks who are older. We know how they are potentially infirmed and could be affected. And this hits us much stronger than just putting out facts on an individual. So who do you share your stories with, right? Personal stories are most effective at establishing connections and motivating action when they come from a known, trusted source. So think back to our conversation last week about how much more likely we are to take action when the call to act comes from someone within our existing networks, right? Take a broad view of who constitutes your extended network. Consider people from your address book, email, social media accounts. Now, they're going to be a little bit further away from you than close friends and relatives, right? Maybe neighbors that you speak to on a regular basis, but think of them as in those groups. Organizations like alumni, book clubs, different social organizations you belong to. Pick up basketball league, any of your partner's friends or friends of friends, right? In our first session, a couple of people asked about reaching out to and persuading people who deeply disagree on core issues. And honestly, I'll tell you, I don't think it's worth the time and energy investment on your part. We have 42 days left, 41 days and a wake up, as my governor likes to say. We have 42 days left until the election. So the time to try to change people's minds that you fundamentally disagree on core issues is probably not right now. You might want to spend more time investing in folks that are on the edge, haven't made up their mind, or closer to where you are, but you need to compel them to give in to that final last reason to vote. So I don't want to say that we don't want to talk to folks who we deeply disagree on core issues. We do. The urgency of the brief window between now and the election makes this not the best use of your time right now, but there's still people that you should invest energy in engaging throughout the year. So just regularly having conversations with folks. But right now, we probably want to focus much more on those who are persuadable. That's who matters who to share your stories with, right? So what are some common features of compelling personal stories? We'd love for you to throw some answers into the chat and YouTube so that we can see what they are and you can share with each other and connect that way. What are some common features of compelling personal story? So we're going to structure a personal story now. The most effective stories for motivating action, and that's specifically action in the form of voting, donating, or volunteering, follow a consistent formula. So first, let's learn the framework for making political stories relatable and powerful to audiences. Then we'll apply the 4-step formula to think about your own stories and how you might use them to connect with and motivate the people in your life. And we'll go through those 4 steps. And I actually have a personal story I'm going to tell here to kind of drive that point home. But let's jump into it right now and look at how we're going to break this down. So we're looking at a public narrative, right? The formula for connecting political issues to personal experience. You have 3 big pieces here. You have the story of now, the story of us, and the story of self, right? And they all work in conjunction with each other. You'll see next to the story of self where it says the 4 things that we're going to cover in a few: challenge, choice, outcome, and ask. And I'll get to those. But first, I just wanted to go over how these pieces come together. The story of self is a personal story that clearly and concisely encapsulate your values and why you are taking action, right? Just as a personal anecdote on this part, I used to do trainings for what's called precinct captains. So in where I live in the state of Maryland, there's a small piece of area called a precinct in an election area. And so we'd have someone that was in charge of that, and they needed to go out and talk to voters in their precinct and turn them out to vote. The most common question I would get on that, outside of the actual knocking on the doors or talking to them, was, well, what's the message? What messages am I putting out there? What are the candidates telling me to message? What's our message? And I would say over and over again to them, your message is the reason why you're knocking on the door. So, for instance, my story of self would be I'm out here today, and I would say the reason that has me up at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning volunteering and to make it personal. That's the personal story of self. Concisely encapsulates your values, why you're taking action. I I have a young daughter. I am looking at the future of this country where women are being treated unequally. And as we continue to go forward, I'm not going to sit by and let it happen. So I actually go out and knock doors with my daughter. She's very helpful with me in that. So that's my personal story of why I'm going out and knocking doors to provide, to make sure that the next generation has at least the same rights that we do right now and enjoy. So these are the reasons why you get out of bed and why you're there. What's your story? What's your reason to do it? And it fits into a larger model, into the story of us. That's the collective story of a group or community's shared purpose, goals, and vision. What is the community's shared history, right? This speaks to the important political issues relevant for your community and the values and beliefs those issues reflect. So, unlike the story of self, this is less a literal story as it is more of an awareness of place, culture, and worldview. So, the story of us all together, our shared values, right? In determining what personal stories of self to share and the issues of most personal import to the people in your network. And then we have the story of now. So, like the story of self, it's less of a personal story of why you're doing it, why you're out to do that work. And it's about shaping your story of self through a lens that clearly communicates to the audience two things: urgency and importance of action, and specific ways to take action now. And we're always going to get to that point where we're getting to that ask. And that story of now is going to bring that urgency of why we need to act. So let's look at the anatomy of a story of self. Four things: challenge, choice, outcome, and ask. So let's jump right into challenge. Challenge is an issue that motivates action. Begin the personal story with share with others by expressing how a political issue shapes your daily experience, right? So in our example, Alvin Baker, as you can see here, regular guy in Arizona, wants to motivate his neighbor to vote. He knows from their conversation they share the same values, but his neighbors express some apathy about voting in their political climate in general. So Alvin begins by expressing the personal challenge presented by the real world impacts of political decisions, right? So did you hear about another teacher at our kids' school quit because of lousy work conditions? They've had subs for over a month. It's really insulting to hear people talking about abolishing the Department of Education. So we've connected that, right? We can't even keep teachers in our classrooms. Then we move on to our choice. So I've started out with the challenge right there. Segue into choice. How did the experience of that challenge direct your actions, and what avenues exist to realistically make that change? Well, I try to volunteer at the school when I can, but I feel like nothing's really changing. And when I address the root causes, I think this election is a good way to do that. So now I'm making a choice. What's my outcome from that? Right? Set up. Well, I started attending these White Dudes for Harris calls to connect with other dads who believe it's time we start investing in education. So this is the outcome from that challenge, choice, and the challenge and choice brings us to this outcome. I want to find like-minded community members, learn strategies for mobilizing people in this. But we finish with an ask. Here's the final stage. We have a call coming up next Tuesday at 5 p.m. We're going to be learning how to use social media to get the word out about the Harris campaign. Are you down to join? And that's your final ask. You're going to end this with a call to action or an ask. And that's what we always want to end this with. Challenge, your choice, your outcome, your ask, right? And an effective ask is arguably the most critical part of sharing your story with others. Recall our two goals: establishing connection, motivating action. Our challenge, choice, and outcome serve to build the connection, and our well-crafted ask is the means by which we invite the action. So focus on your clear asks, right? Make a plan. Do you know where your polling location is and when you're going to vote? It's incredibly important when we get to that stage, making a plan, that we are talking through that process. That is a clear ask, right? Do you know where your polling location when you're going to vote? Walk them through that. Join you for volunteering. This is another example. Will you join me canvassing this Saturday at 1 p.m. in Bridgeview? And I sometimes will word it a little bit differently so they can't give me a no. I do what's called the cascade of asks, right? You start up here and you move down slowly. You say, hey, we've got some opportunities to make some canvassing this Saturday at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Which one would you like to go to? And that puts the ball firmly in their court. You're assuming they're going to say yes, and you let them determine the 10 or 2. They can't do it that way. Well, we're also doing it on Sunday, and here's our times. Really go down the cascade of asks. Or vote triple. Can you text 3 people in your contacts and remind them to vote? Right now, obviously not you vote triple, but you're tripling your vote by asking folks, hey, can you also reach out to other people? So that's a magnifying effect, right? But focus on clear asks that you can get a clear answer to, and you want an outcome to come from. Okay. So let's practice, right? I'm going to go through a story I wrote real quick, a challenge, choice, outcome, and ask. And you guys can put into the chat in YouTube where you think the challenge, the choice, and the outcome, and the ask were. Spoiler alert, I'm going to actually announce them as well while I'm doing it, just so we're clear where everything is. But this is how I'd start this conversation. Hey, did you hear about that county council bringing up a bill that bans certain books in our school? I can't think of something more un-American than book banning by our county council. So I've been reading about this council trying to pass other things like this that undermine who we are as a country, what we're all about. And I know the presidential race is super important, but I think we need to focus on these local races too and talk with our neighbors about it. So that's my choice, right? Challenge was the book banning. My choice is, I think this is what we need to do. And my outcome, I signed up for the email list for one of the candidates who's challenging one of these book banners. And I went to one of the organizing meetings, and it's been really interesting and informative to find out exactly what they're about and even bigger issues that they could be involved in. So talking to this person that's a little bit on the fence, right? And then I finished with my ask. We have a meeting this Thursday night. I'd love if you came and joined us. I can even come and pick you up. I know we don't want this kind of nonsense to continue on our council. Can you come up? So I've got my challenge. You hear about this book ban. I've got my choice. I've been reading up more about this, and I really think that we could get more involved in these local races and turn it over. What's my outcome? Well, I signed up through an email. I went to a meeting. I think it's pretty cool. And now my ask is, I'd like you to come with me to the next one. We can learn more about this race and how we can get involved. We can stop this from happening on our county council. So that's your challenge, your choice, your outcome, and ask in that story right there, right? So I want you to think about that as you're crafting your own personal stories when you're talking to voters as well. So tailoring personal stories. Remember, different aspects of the same story may need to be emphasized to best connect with different audiences. So just like a personal story appeals to a voter in different ways, emotions, logic, your own credibility, the focal point of the story itself may be emphasized for unique audiences, right? So while sharing a story, keep in mind how the audience interacts with the topic that's being discussed. Each element is interconnected, leads to clearer, more convincing stories. In this illustration, you see the rhetorical triangle here. You've got the topic of the issue, the audience, the candidate, the party, right? How they come together. Each part matters equally. So using this framework, let's explore down an audience and the topic and the impact of how the conversation takes place. Example, if the why is related to equitable public education, how that's discussed and how the story is chosen to illustrate it will be different in tone, context, how you emphasize it, the vocabulary that you use, depending on whether you're addressing like an AFT member. And for those of you who don't know, that's the American Federation of Teachers, one of our 2 big teachers unions in America. AFT member teachers, or are we talking to volunteers, donors, or persuadable voters? So we need to make sure we tailor our personal stories, what's commonly referred to as code switching, knowing who our audience is, and being able to have those conversations in an effective manner. So I've got a questions tab up here too. I don't know if there are any questions that are coming in from the folks on our team, but I'll keep the chat up looking for that. I did want to talk about our key takeaways from here. Takeaway number 1, personal stories are the best means of establishing connection, motivating others to action. Again, voting is an emotional act, no matter how we want to think of it. Otherwise, it very much is. We are humans. We are mammals. We are social creatures. We share our stories. 200,000 years ago, we sat around a fire and we talked, and we still do that today. And we evolved in a way that means that we are story creation machines. We consume them and we create them, and it's how we communicate. It's an incredibly important aspect of everything we do. So there's no reason why we should not be using effective stories, personal stories, in elections, right? So it's incredibly important that we are approaching this from that standpoint. Takeaway number two, effective personal stories tend to follow a consistent structure: challenge, choice, outcome, and ask. We went through that specifically. Takeaway number three, focus on making asks that invite people to take a very specific single action. Vote, remind others to vote, volunteer, donate, share messaging of some sort, right? And I always, like I said, I like to, when I'm talking to volunteers, ask the cascade of asks. Can you do this? No. Well, what about this? Well, what about this? How about this? Right? Make sure that you have those asks ready to go. So from that, I'd ask, you tell us what you think. We have a trainer evaluation code in there. We have a QR code. You can scan that and complete a brief survey. And if you have more questions, you can email directed to live training at traindemocrats.org. Again, live training at traindemocrats.org. If you have not signed up for an account at traindemocrats.org, we would ask that you do, especially if you're thinking about volunteering, helping a candidate, or looking at running yourself. It's a great opportunity to get as much training as possible on everything from field to fundraising to messaging to digital to campaign management, everything that you could possibly think of, all in one place under the NDTs. So we're going to look at next week, I believe joining us next week. Learn how to engage your online networks and motivate them to take actions like voting and volunteering. That's going to be next week's one. So a viewer asks, do you mention Project 2025 specifically or stick to aspects and pieces of policy? I find it hard to introduce people to the whole threat and all of the evidence without sounding tinfoily. Yeah, so that's a great question. Agreed. I believe in taking one aspect of it, right, and saying, this is an issue that is coming up that Donald Trump and JD Vance want to push. This is part of Project 2025. Don't try to take it all in its entirety. I just like to take one of the crazy things that's in there and highlight that, right? Because you're right. I think that if you do try to go at it all at once, sometimes it does come across a little coily. It's good to get into specifics. And again, remember, specifics lets you do what? Tell a story, put a name and a face to it, right? So it's again incredibly important, I think, to keep it as specific as you can and to be able to tell it in a way that there's a story. So that's it for me. I want to thank you guys so much. I want to thank White Juice for Harris having me on here. I did bring my Smith Island fishing tournament hat just because I wanted to be as white dude as I could right now. So I appreciate the time. And thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you guys.